Welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you join us today. Um, First, let me welcome all of you to the Society of Gender Professionals Virtual Gender Cafe, Rethinking Binarism in Our Work. I'm Thảo Nguyễn, she, her, and I will provide you a brief intro about SGP before I pass the mic to Brenna Kuch, our moderator. This is a two-part series that builds off of a gender cafe last year that I organized called Beyond the Binary in International Development. Our last section was called Rethinking Binarism in Our Everyday Lives. We hope to have you continue engaging in many more conversations after this trilogy. Next slide, please. SGP is active on Twitter, and you could follow us and use our hashtag Rethinking Binaries to keep the discussions going wherever you are. You can also tag us in your posts as well. Next slide, please. Before we begin this gender cafe, I want to quickly introduce the Society of Gender Professionals. For those of you who may not already be familiar with us, SGP is an international association of gender practitioners, academics, and activists dedicated to promoting feminist action and applied research and raising the profile of gender expertise around the world. On the screen, you can see our mission, which includes to support member collaboration, network building, mentoring, and leadership, and to advance gender equity. We have members all around the world, and we launched our new website and membership structure with exclusive benefits last year. You should check out our website, genderprofessionals.org, and become members if you have not already. Next slide, please. One of the things that SGP does to foster the production and dissemination of applied gender research is to host gender cafes. We have one every few months. These are virtual conversations series connecting gender practitioners, academics, and activists to explore pressing gender issues. These gender cafes also provide non-hierarchical sharing, questioning, and peer learning space beyond the classroom. Gender cafes also provide professional development opportunities for members interested in raising the profile of gender expertise. Next slide, please. And now, before I introduce our first moderator, let me quickly explain that we are all currently in the same Zoom room, but after the presentation, we will break out into separate rooms to have a discussion. We will not be recording the conversations in the breakout rooms. The only thing you need to do is to click on the button that says Join Breakout Room once it pops on your screen. Before we return to the main section, you will get a warning on your screen and you will be brought back to the main room without any action on your part. Next slide, please. All right, let's get the conversation started. First up, I'm going to introduce Brenna Kuch. Brenna from Portland, Oregon, United States, is a professional in human resources and organizational inclusion. She currently works at USAID in Washington, D.C., USA, where she is on the board of the Gender and Sexual Minorities Employee Resource Group. Brenna, I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Thanks. I almost forgot to unmute myself. Thanks so much for the intro, and hello again, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Thanks to everyone who is joining us today or watching at a later time. Next. So our agenda for the day, after a quick intro, each of the three panelists / presenters will do what I like to call a shallow deep dive. So each one will spend 5 to 10 minutes talking about a specific aspect of their work as opposed to the entire overview, and then we'll have some time for Q&A after that. So then we'll split up into breakout rooms, like Tao mentioned, and talk about how we are all incorporating sex and gender inclusivity into our work, education, and activism. Then each group will give a short report back, and we'll wrap up. So again, we're recording the session. You can watch later, you can share with your friends, but the breakout sessions will not be recorded. Next. So the first session was really a primer on some of the concepts around sex and gender that is necessary to understand before we move to operationalizing that. So our goals for today are to see examples of and learn more about the inclusive programs, research, policies, etc. from our speakers. We'll learn about the work and activism of our panelists, and then in the breakout rooms, we'll discuss among ourselves how to incorporate these, as well as sharing resources, problems, and ideas from our own work. Next. So first, who are we going to see today? Next slide. Most of these faces you'll recognize from the last session. So today, I'm very thrilled to hear from our presenters, Nassim, Crystal, and Sebastian, who are on the right side there. Those three, plus Chris and Noelle, will be leading breakout rooms. Tao, you've already heard from, and please check out her related session from last year, Beyond the Binary and International Development, on our website. And then Rashima, who was with us for session 1, was not able to join us today, but we hope to have her back on a future panel because she is awesome. Next slide. What a Pride Month it has been, especially in the US. So as a reminder, Pride commemorates the Stonewall Uprising in June of 1969, which was led by trans people of color. Pride is a time to promote the dignity, equality, and visibility of LGBT people. And again, we acknowledge everyone who has and is currently standing up to injustice around the world. Thank you for fighting for us all. Next slide. Some shockingly good Pride news last week in the US this month. The Supreme Court ruled that it is no longer legal in any state to discriminate against someone at work based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Before then, it was completely legal to fire or refuse to hire someone for being trans or non-binary or queer in about half the states in the US. So Amy Stevens, pictured here, is one of the original cases brought forward. She died earlier this year, so may she rest in power, and we thank her profusely for her activism. This case is a huge win, but as we all know, discrimination happens in many explicit and implicit ways that circumvent the bounds of the law. Next slide. As Ilya Parker of Decolonizing Fitness reminds us, a Supreme Court ruling will not fix a very long, intricate history of discrimination. In this post on Instagram, they say 1 in 3 Black trans people makes less than $10,000 annually. I think this is in the US. Let's continue to shed light on the barriers that prevent us from even getting hired in the first place. Discrimination is technically illegal for many people around the world, and yet they still face it daily. This happens for many reasons, but one of those is the unconscious bias that comes from the lack of understanding. So part of why we're doing this series is to reflect on the gender binary and its very inflexible boxes which harm everybody. The more we understand, the more inclusive we can make the world around us, especially in our work, education, and activism. Next. And on that note, I'm going to do a super quick recap. So hopefully you all joined us for or have watched the previous session, but if not, it's available on the website and we go into these topics more in depth. Oh, thank you, Des. Sex and gender are different and neither are binary. So sex is physical characteristics such as gonads and hormones. While babies are almost always assigned male or female at birth, there are over 40 variations of intersex characteristics. Gender is someone's internal sense of identity. It is biopsychosocial and it involves social and cultural norms, rules, behaviors, and more. So check out the podcast Gender Reveal for fantastic discussions and thoughts about gender. Next. Not only are sex and gender different categories, so are gender expression and sexuality. None of these are binary, they're not necessarily static, and they don't exist on a one-dimensional spectrum. The Trevor Project uses these amoeba graphics, as I call them, which I think does a better job of showing the diversity and beauty of the human experience, as opposed to the traditional spectrum model. Next. Non-binary people exist all over the world and have for centuries. Unfortunately, colonizers oppressed those who didn't align with their definition of proper male and female. We use the term non-binary as a general umbrella term to mean all the identities that exist outside of woman or man, of which there are hundreds around the world. Next. We learned a bit about intersex, and we will hear more about that today from our speakers. So despite intersex variations appearing in nearly or possibly more than 2% of the population, they experience significant marginalization, discrimination, and erasure. Next. Most government documentation provides only binary options for sex and gender, and there's still a lot of harm and discrimination out there. Legal and social rights have a very long way to go. So many of these things have been institutionalized, making it very difficult to move beyond the binary. Today, we're going to learn more about how activists around the world are creating more equitable and inclusive organizations and societies. Next. Without further ado, each of our panelists, like I mentioned, will speak for 5 to 10 minutes on their shallow deep dives. I think we could each hear from each of them for hours on end. I know I could. So we're just going to touch on some things. So please enter your questions in the chat box while they're speaking, and we'll answer some of those questions at that Q&A time after all 3 have presented. Next slide. First up is Nazim, a fiction Master of Fine Arts candidate at the University of Nevada, Reno. They're Chicago-born and raised by Iranian immigrants. Nazim has a really great background that combines being a scientist and a writer and an activist, which is so cool. Focusing on sex and gender inclusion and lots of other things that they will talk about. So, Missy, go for it.
Thanks, Brenna. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from my end of the world. Anyway, hello. So thank you all so much for being here. Today, I'm going to talk about TERFs, biological essentialism, and the importance of fiction. I want to mention here that I'll be using trans for transgender and cis for cisgender, and my use of trans also encompasses non-binary experiences. Next slide, please. First, what's a TERF? TERF stands for Trans-Exclusive Radical Feminist. Radical feminism argues that women are oppressed due to their relationship to men in a world that's dominated by men. This movement specifically cares about cisgender people, which you'll remember means an individual who is assigned a gender at birth that they identify with. Trans-exclusive radical feminists, or TERFs, reinforce the gender binary and believe that being transgender perpetuates gender norms and is harmful to quote-unquote real women. What I'd like you to take away from here is that radical feminism ties womanhood to biological sex, thus believing that gender is biologically essential. Next slide. Biological essentialism ties human traits, such as masculinity or femininity, to biology itself. In other words, biological essentialism believes that despite socialization, gender and so-called gendered traits, like some that you see in this ridiculous picture I found on Google, are inherently tied to biological sex. I don't think I need to tell you that the idea of aspects of your gender being tied to your biology is harmful to both cis and trans people alike. One thing you can do is challenge people when you hear biological essentialist or reductionist ideas, because biology is never so simple as to be able to solely dictate a person's behavior. Next slide, please. Let's talk a bit further about so-called biological sex, which is a social construct. That doesn't mean it's not real, but rather the specific categories and the values we assign to them are deemed by society. This has real-world effects. For example, many biomedical scientists use male rodents in their research because they think it's too difficult to use female rodents, which ultimately affects healthcare and the types of medicines we develop. And this is putting aside intersex rodents, which haven't been used since the 1980s, but I'll get to intersex in a moment. Overall, when people use the term biological sex, usually incorrectly, they divide sexes into male, people who have XY chromosomes, and female, people who have XX chromosomes. But people are given genders at birth based on their genitalia, not because someone checks their chromosomes, and genitalia doesn't necessarily reflect those chromosomes. This is because of how the reproductive system develops. The presence or absence of certain hormones triggers the creation of different reproductive systems from the same base structures. But because a variety of biological factors can affect this development, such as having more than 2 chromosomes or having insensitive hormone receptors, meaning they don't react as well, quote unquote, to certain amounts of hormones, intersex characteristics can also emerge. Intersex, importantly, breaks the sex binary. And intersex individuals are not uncommon. In the US alone, they account for between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 200 people, which is as many as redheads. Here's the big takeaway. The common understanding of biological sex is extremely limited and does not encompass its complexity. Therefore, it should never be used to justify stigma and bigotry. If you hear someone using biological sex to justify the sex or gender binary, you can challenge them on that, and you can encourage them to learn more about intersex characteristics, for instance. Next slide, please. Let's switch gears to think about where our ideas come from and why so many people see biology in such essential ways. I imagine it won't come as a surprise, but our upbringings and the way we're socialized shape our perceptions of the world. One of those really vital and influential contexts is literature. J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, is one author who has changed how people imagine the world, particularly my generation. Which is why it was so disappointing when a few weeks ago, she confirmed that she holds TERF ideologies and perpetuated essentialist notions. I won't go through the details, but she wrote this brief Twitter thread that you see on the screen and a longer blog post perpetuating harmful and incorrect ideologies. My point here isn't to bash her, though her words are severely disappointing. I want to focus more on the kinds of arguments she used and why they're harmful. Next slide, please. First, many of them are straw man arguments. A straw man argument is when someone sets up a situation they make seem analogous, but actually isn't, and then debunks that situation. For example, many TERFs, J.K. Rowling included, argue that certain pro-trans policies will harm cis women and girls by erasing gender-based violence. Honestly, that's utter nonsense. Trans people also experience gender-based violence due to patriarchal values and cultures. In fact, trans people face disproportionate rates of gender-based violence, particularly Black and other trans people of color. Keeping trans women safe keeps cis women safe. They're not incongruous ideas. Another big problem, particularly in the case of J.K. Rowling, is the spread of misinformation and fear through a large platform. Research has debunked much of the claims she has made, such as the idea that people commonly detransition after transitioning, and her perpetuation of different anti-trans myths, such as cis men pretending to be trans women to access spaces of cis women and girls, is deeply harmful. Here's the thing. Authors have power and responsibilities. J.K. Rowling's blog post has already had real-world impacts, where a conservative US senator used her arguments in order to fight against trans rights. Imagine instead if she had used her words to create spaces for trans folks, challenging exclusionary ideology. Fiction can be used to change our world, and authors have that power. Next slide, please. I'm going to end on an easy way for all of us to affect change. We can choose what we read and what our children read, what our schools get, what our libraries and community centers get. Here are a few books by trans and intersex authors of colors in the United States, though there are obviously many more, and clearly books written by white trans and intersex authors as well. I'd love if in the comments you could drop recommendations for similar books in your own countries and languages, especially ones that are not written in English. That's my presentation. Thank you all so much for your attention. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce Crystal Hendricks, an intersex activist and the chairperson of Intersex South Africa, who works to ensure that intersex people themselves are centered in conversations and decisions on issues that have direct impact on their lived experiences. I'm thrilled to turn it over to her. Take it away, Crystal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Naseem, and thank you, SGP, for having me today. Wow, I think this conversation is so needed in the world today, and it's such a affirming conversation during this time. Just adding on, Naseem, when we look at intersex people, normally people also trapped within binaries that they see biological sex as being binary. However, biological sex is not just male and female. There's many different characteristics around that, and therefore we can see as many 40 intersex variations. And also in today's world, we can see that there is definitely a confusion regarding intersex and gender identity or sexual orientation, when being intersex has nothing to do with these two. And just getting back on the trans-exclusive feminism, definitely within the intersex scope as well, that is what happens to intersex women as well. Taking it back to a conversation with intersex women are also fighting for genital mutilation, which is happening to intersex women on a daily. And we are fighting to stop genital mutilation, where feminists are also fighting to end feminine genital mutilation. So if these two struggles are very intersectional, so if feminists and intersex people could work together and they can find a common ground and work from grassroots, there's a way that we can destroy these binaries and we can definitely live beyond binaries, right? Just looking at the world today within LGBTI movements as well, right? We can see that there is opportunities within the LGBTI to include social inclusion, right? Advocacy and programming can leverage the greater visibility towards promoting greater acceptance by the public, government, religious, and organizations, and as well in the workplace as well. We need to definitely start working as organizations on the leave no one behind agenda to make sure that we mobilize everyone and we push governments to close the gaps between commitments and the implementations of policies and programs. And if you look at the greater umbrella of the LGBT, you will see a lot of vocal or a lot of things are being expressed regarding rights of gay people, lesbian people, bisexual people, and sometimes trans and intersex people gets left behind or are completely excluded out of the conversation, right? So how do we live in a world beyond binaries where we don't judge each other in our own community as the LGBTIQ plus community? How do we also live beyond binaries? Because thinking of relationships, and we see people are still in the heteronormative of there needs to be one feminine, one butch, one male appeal, and it's just that we are so clouded in binaries that we are not seeing anything beyond it. And the moment we open our eyes and realize that we are all just human trying to do the best we can do with our lives and live it to the best way possible, that's the moment we can live beyond binaries, and we can become more inclusive as human, as organizations, and as workplaces as well, right? So the fact is that definitely impacts intersex people as well as people in the LGBTQI community as broad, as well as females as well. That factors around social exclusion of LGBT individuals, right? Influencing them will affect many downstream factors that have more immediate impact on people's lives, like workplace discrimination, rejection by family, or denial of marriage rights. And this is similar things that we are fighting. This has been fighting for generations on. But the moment we make the fight within binaries, that is the moment when we lose the entire plot, or we lose our resolution, I would say, to get to the point of where we want or seek an answer for the issues that we face on a daily. I'd like to, especially when we talk about beyond binaries and fighting the binarism, right? There's struggles that intersex people face. And because of the struggles that intersex people face, it leads to discrimination to this community, right? We all are aware that what intersex is and what intersex means, and I'm not going to go into detail of that. But I would like to speak about challenges that intersex people face on a daily, because this will give you something to think about as well when you are in your workplace or in your organization, to think, how can we become more inclusive with intersex people, since they are facing different challenges outside of what the community as the LGBTQI plus are facing, right? So one of the biggest struggles for intersex people is normalizing surgery, because the world sees biology or sex as binary, male and female. They want to normalize intersex people, so we fit the binary notions, so we look a certain way as to male and female. And the moment we realize that intersex people are being coerced into surgeries, they are being misinformation about their bodies, that forces them into binary of choosing a category of male or female. That's the moment we learn how to advocate for intersex people, and that's how our allyship will grow as well within the community, to make sure that we are fighting the fight for intersex people. Intersex people are dealing with a lot of death and abandonment. In South Africa, my country, we've done statistics where it was discovered that out of 5 out of 10 intersex children born in rural areas through a traditional sector, which means they don't go to a hospital, but they have a home birth with either a traditional healer or traditional doctor, when there is visible intersex traits, right, that child is seen as a curse, and the child will then, they will basically kill the child. And that's how the infanticide started. And when you do research, you find that this is common practices, that an intersex child is seen as a bad omen because they do not fit typical binary notions of how a male and a female should look like. And it's then the choice to say that this is a curse, this is a bad omen, and that is unfortunately the route they take to deal with these children. There's obviously a lack of legal recognition, and that's obviously giving the doctors the opportunity to perform surgeries, normalizing surgeries on intersex children, because they don't have legal recognition. The only country that I'm aware of is Geneva, that has great policies that no surgery can be done on intersex children until they come at a certain age where they can make the choice to have surgery themselves. However, in many other countries, surgeries are done at birth, with children only finding out in the adult stage that they've had surgery, or even that they are intersex, but they don't even know what's going on with their bodies. Like the LGBTQI community, the intersex community also faces a lot of discrimination, especially when it comes to with binarism, in fitting into binaries of male and female. Intersex children are normally assigned a certain gender at birth of either male and female. Definitely growing up, intersex children can identify however they wish to identify. However, most of the times intersex children then run into the struggle of legal gender recognition, where they are unable to change their legal gender recognition because of how they were labeled at birth, even though they don't identify as that binary gender. So we need to also look at a world where there could be an option. I know there is countries that come up with an option as an X that could be updated at a later stage, or you could also keep your gender, your sex marker as an X. However, some countries you are forced to be in the binary of either male and female. And also, like I said, a lack of legal representation and a lack of law development as well. So my question to the group in itself is to think that when we are looking at intersex people and we realize that being intersex is definitely not a sexual orientation or gender identity, however, it's sexual characteristics of how you were born. Intersex people do not fit the typical male and female binaries, and they already beyond binaries. So when you think of the work that you are doing as an organization, as an activist, as a professor, as a lawmaker, what policies do you feel can be designed to ensure that we become more intersex inclusive as well, and especially transgender inclusive as well? I want to thank you so much for your time after the short conversation, and that's it for me for now. And last, I'd like to introduce Sebastian Aguilera-Betancourt. Sebastian holds an MA in Human Rights and Cultural Diversity and focuses on gender equality and LGBTI rights through their work, which is currently at the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastian. My pronouns are they and them. At ILGA, I work for the UN Advocacy Program, and my job particularly focuses at the treaty bodies and special procedures mechanisms of the United Nations. I'm going to try to focus my presentation today at the importance of disaggregated data, which is something that we talked about in the previous session. So for this, I'm going to share an example of my work engaging with the UN treaty bodies, the special procedures, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Very quickly, the United Nations Special Procedures are independent human rights experts who are mandated to report and advise on human rights from a thematic or country-specific perspective. Next slide, please. These experts, known as special rapporteurs, independent experts, or working groups, usually release calls for submission, so they send out questionnaires for human rights defenders to respond to. My last contribution for the special procedures was in response to the call for submissions made by the special rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. This independent expert basically asked for information on best practices and challenges when integrating a gender perspective in transitional justice processes. They particularly asked for information on how LGBTI persons were included in the gender approach of these processes. Next slide, please. So what is transitional justice? The International Center for Transitional Justice has defined transitional justice as a response to systematic or widespread violations of human rights. Transitional justice seeks recognitions for the victims and to promote possibilities for peace, reconciliation, and democracy. It is not a special kind of justice, but rather justice adapted to societies that are transforming themselves after a period of pervasive human rights abuses. In some cases, these transformations happen suddenly. In others, they might take place over decades. So transitional justice processes are all the strategies and mechanisms adopted in a country that is transitioning from a period of conflict to a period of peace. They often involve truth commissions, trials, administrative reorganizations, national building, commemoration of victims, reparations, etc. Violence against people who experience sexual orientation, gender identity and or expression, and sex characteristics in diverse and non-normative ways has been largely unexamined in the field of transitional justice, often as a consequence of a narrow construction of gender-based violence that is anchored in the normative male and female binary and its corresponding assumptions of heterosexuality. Next slide, please. I focused the written contribution that I prepared in response to the questionnaire on transitional justice in 3 countries, Sierra Leone, the Philippines, and Colombia. Why these 3 countries? Because they vary a lot in their approaches to sexual orientation and gender identity. In Sierra Leone, for example, homosexuality and any form of same-sex desire or diverse gender identities and expressions are criminalized. In the Philippines, even though is no criminalization, people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and or expressions still face a lot of barriers, discrimination, and violence, and LGBTI victims of the conflict were not only not included in the peace process, but their legal and social situation actually worsened in places such as Mindanao after the peace negotiations. For the case of Colombia, this has been the first and only country that tried to comprehensively include the experiences of LGBTI persons under the gender approach of its transitional justice process. Next slide, please. So what is disaggregated data? Basically, any data that is collected and broken down into smaller groups or categories. For example, there is gender disaggregated data, which has been understood as data that is collected and presented separately on women and men, again, reinforcing the binary. So why is disaggregated data important for these processes and for the contribution that Ilga submitted to the Special Rapporteur? Well, first of all, people with diverse and non-normative sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions and sexual characteristics, that is LGBTI persons and others who do not necessarily identify as such, have traditionally not been included in national systems for collecting data on society. In other words, there is a serious gap in the data available to capture the lived realities of LGBTI people. This is a reflection of the specific histories of inequality and oppression related to these characteristics. Disaggregated data is important to reveal patterns that can otherwise be obscured or not evident in larger aggregated data. So this data can reveal unique experiences faced by people with intersecting identities, meaning that it allows us to understand how multidimensional factors affect different people in different ways based on the different aspects of their identities. For example, race, age, nationality, gender identity, sex characteristics, etc. Next slide, please. So in the context of transitional justice processes, this refers, for example, to data that addresses how LGBTI persons were particularly and disproportionately affected by the conflict, or specific data on how trans, non-binary, and intersex persons experience violence and discrimination due to these characteristics. This data is essential for the mechanisms and strategies that are set up in transitional justice processes to better understand, include, and remedy the harms that victims suffered. For example, in the case of Sierra Leone, due to the criminalization, there was no data on sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics in any official document relating to the conflict. The gender perspective of the transitional justice process only included the experiences of cisgender heterosexual women, which reinforced the gender binary, and therefore the narrative of the conflict excluded completely the experiences of persons with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and sex characteristics. In the case of the Philippines, a gender component was included in some mechanisms of their transitional justice process, but just like the case of Sierra Leone, this approach was limited in its conception of gender. There was no official data on the experiences of LGBTI persons affected by the conflict. However, some local NGOs do work with victims and develop some valuable data. In the case of Colombia, the fact that the gender perspective was more comprehensive in its approach to gender made possible to include the experiences of LGBTI persons. This has been reflected in the multiple documents that have been released or issued by the Truth Commission and the National Center for the Reconstruction of Memory. We have, for example, standalone reports on trans women, which are very valuable for the construction of an inclusive narrative of the conflict and for the recognition of trans women as victims of the conflict. This aggregated data has been important in the transitional justice process here in Colombia. For example, the Unit for Victims has data on how many people were persecuted due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. So there are 3,720 victims that have been identified so far, but this information does not reflect the actual total because of the challenges of collecting data in context of armed conflict, where people were forcibly disappeared, for example, and where there were historically not enough efforts to find out if a body of a person who was killed in the conflict was or not LGBTI. The data has helped identify the number of LGBTI victims, and this is instrumental to better know how to repair them and guarantee that these events no longer happen. However, the way the data is managed and presented is still a little confusing. You can see, for example, in this chart, that they include information of LGBTI persons and intersex persons, so include only intersex persons as separate. But then in the graphic, we only have information on men and women, not clarifying, for example, how many of them are cisgender or transgender or non-binary. This could be improved, for instance, by including each of the different SOGS characteristics by separate, SOGS meaning sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics, in questionnaires and other tools for data collection and presenting them in the graphic as well, and seeing how they intersect with each other too. Even if the total number of LGBTI victims identified so far seem like a small percentage, it doesn't mean it is not important to understand how LGBTI people were particularly affected by the conflict. If we don't collect this data, then the experiences of whole communities and diverse persons are erased. Next slide, please. Here in Colombia, there are still a lot of challenges regarding disaggregated data. For example, there is a high subregistry of violence against LGBTI persons. And the disaggregated data doesn't really include each of the different SOGS characteristics by separate. So there's little information on how LGBTI women were particularly targeted by the conflict. And this could be due to a lack of staff that is trained in gender issues and LGBTI issues in a comprehensive way that does not reinforce the gender binary and assumptions of heterosexuality and stereotypes. In the case of Sierra Leone, it's basically impossible to gather this data without compromising anyone's safety and privacy due to the criminalization. So social attitudes and legal barriers make it a lot harder to have disaggregated data. I just want to add that the written contribution that we presented to the Special Rapporteur was developed with the help of local NGOs. So I interviewed local defenders from these 3 countries, and most of them mentioned the importance of disaggregated data. So this is what we recommended in our written contribution to the Special Rapporteur, so that they could pass these recommendations to the states through their own thematic report. And hopefully future transitional justice processes will include a specific data on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. Next slide, please. To finish, I just want to add that if you're interested in learning about data collection and advocacy at the UN, I want to invite you to participate in ILGA's webinar, which will be held next Monday. So thank you so much, and back to you, Brenna.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for putting together these presentations. We can't applaud you, but we would if we were in person. So we've been collecting all the questions coming in the chat box, and we'll spend some more, just a little bit of time answering those before our breakout sessions to give you some more information. And then first I have 1 or 2 questions that were sort of based on the questions that were submitted with the registration. So this one came in many forms, which is, and I would love to pose it to all of our panelists, how do I start rethinking binarism at work when my sector or my country is very binary and not very inclusive? And I know you all sort of touched on this, but in terms of people who are trying to do this at work, do you have maybe 1 or 2 recommendations for really how to start?
Hi everyone, it's Crystal. I think we have to start very small, especially if your country is very binary and not very inclusive. I think at my workplace about 6 months ago, I asked if we could have gender neutral bathrooms, because we only had male and female bathrooms, and not everybody was comfortable in using those bathrooms. And I actually brought this up in dialogue session, and I asked, could we have non-binary or bathrooms? And I think that was a good start. And at that moment, we could see non-binary or trans or intersex people felt more comfortable in going to the bathroom as they felt safe to go to the bathroom. And I think that is a way that we started to live beyond the binary, right? Sometimes even some companies, their payroll numbers, sometimes it's an identification of male and female within their payroll number or their payroll ID. So it's things that we can, how do we take that away from there, where it's not based on gender, but it's just based on either when you started with the company or your job title. So I think sometimes it's just something you can start small. You don't have to just start trying to break the binaries all at once, but maybe starting small and doing something that is progressive and that makes non-binary or gender fluid people just feel safe in the work environment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal.
I would like to add to that. Thank you for that, Crystal. That was amazing. That maybe bringing up the topic, it's a good start. Raising awareness and organizing groups within your workplace to talk about these issues, and challenging and speaking also about gender stereotypes. For example, in the way that we are supposed to present ourselves in our workplace. Like in the way we are supposed to be dressed and stuff like that. That is also good ways to start rethinking binarism in the places that we work.
There are also small, I mean, some ways that it's not, this is even goes beyond the workplace, but like when you introduce yourself to somebody, you include your pronouns, like when you do, to normalize that. That way, if somebody, you do it in the workplace and somebody asks like, oh, why did you do that? You can have that conversation, and you can do that, you can attach it to the bottom of your emails, or if you have social media for work, you can talk about that. But I think, one of the things I think is important is also doing, starting even smaller than the workplace, thinking about yourself, thinking about the stuff that you consume. You'd like pick up, for example, you could pick up a book about, written by an intersex author and be like, oh, I just read this great book over the weekend and it was this. And I think sometimes the small conversations like that can also be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, having those starting very small in your workplace and just getting people to think about it, then maybe later down the line, it's easier to incorporate them into the work that you're doing with outside people, right? Great. And then there's one more question that kind of comes up a lot around just allyship in general and communication. So how can we sort of respectfully and kindly call in our colleagues who may be using outdated or like very binary concepts related to gender? So this can be just, interpersonally, but also if they're having these conversations with, people out in the community.
One thing that I'd love to hear what Sebastian and Crystal think about this, but I tend to find that conversations like this are more useful or more helpful in a one-on-one context. I don't tend to believe, if somebody is willing to learn, I don't tend to want to call them in a group context or whatever, because that can make them very defensive. And if the point is to have this conversation and try to get them to grow, then I don't think that can be very helpful. So thinking about having a one-on-one context, being like, hey, I know, whether it's like in a text message or an email, like, hey, I noticed you use this phrase, or after the meeting, like pulling them aside, and making it a conversation, and knowing that you don't have to be the expert. We have like great resources that SGP has been collecting, but having resources you can direct people to, having them start with baby steps also, like they don't have to jump right away to suddenly being inclusive. If someone is using outdated language, I think that's more indicative of not having the education usually, rather than purposely being exclusionary.
I think depending on the context, sometimes just modeling that behavior can be helpful. So I've been in circles where sex work is being discussed using other terms, and even just introducing a more or a less stigmatizing term into the conversation, you start seeing people adapt that language. So sometimes that works as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely echoing Naseem as well on the one-to-one basis. I believe that we all can unlearn and learn new things. But if we have the resources and we do it one-on-one and more personal to it, because I mean, this is a sensitive topic and it is personal. And when we become more personal about it, I think then it becomes more, it's easy to accept and it's easy to unlearn and learn new behaviors and new ways of thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I am an optimist, but I do genuinely believe that most people want to do the right thing. And sometimes we're scared to tell them because we think it feels rude. I'm the same way. But I always appreciate when somebody informs me in a respectful way. So it's hard, just like have the conversation privately and then, leave. And usually that's, if people want to learn more, there's the internet. Okay, so we had some questions in the chat. That I'll pull out, and then we'll just spend a few minutes here, and then we'll go into those breakout rooms like we mentioned and make sure we have plenty of time to share resources. So there was one, just real quick, was already answered in the chat, and I'll just say here for the recording. Do we know the proportion of babies born trans or intersex? Intersex is about 2% that we know of. Not everybody knows if they do have intersex characteristics. And so thank you, Crystal and Naseem, I think, if I remember correctly, for answering that in the chat. And then it's really hard to have data on trans people because it's not about how you're born. It's really about the society that you're born in and how that society defines the quote unquote correct gender. So unfortunately, I think we're a really long way away from that. People have a lot of internalized transphobia. So maybe in a perfect world where everybody was accepted, they would be openly trans, but that's not necessarily a thing. So yeah, unfortunately, it's really hard to have data around there.
I want to chime in really quickly too.
Yes.
Sorry, Brenna, but I encourage you to break away from kind of thinking about somebody born trans, because so much of it is about socialization and your environment. And it also thinking about somebody as born trans ties it to the biology, and biological essentialism has been used to try to justify trans people. Like, trans women have female brains, but it's so much more complicated than that. And that tends to lead to more misunderstanding rather than more clarity.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was a question, actually this one's really quick, so it was answered in the chat. We do have resources, we have a bunch of resources, we'll share them out, we'll link them in the presentation. They're already on the website, so if you have any to add to that, that's great. But resources for how to learn more about this and be more inclusive. Another quick one, is the ILJ submission to the UN available online, Sebastian?
So it is not at this moment. It will be when the Special Rapporteur uploads it on their webpage. It will be available on the Special Rapporteur's page. So it's the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion of Truth. You can Google it, and it will probably be available in October, because that's when they will present their report to the General Assembly of the UN.
Okay, great, thank you. But if you want to learn more before then, check out that webinar next Monday. Okay, so there is one question which comes up not infrequently. So how does one handle the acronym when including intersex? I know some intersex people prefer the term to not include them, but some also want to be included. And then someone else added on sort of the best acronym to use as a whole. E.g., is it preferable to include the asexual community as well? So if any of you, I think there was a response in the chat, but some thoughts on that, especially Crystal, in terms of the I.
Thank you, Brenna. Yeah, so it's a very sensitive question, I believe, especially I believe that behaviors are obviously learned. And when you look at the intersex community, so like we've already said, that being intersex is not a sexual orientation or as gender identity, which means that you can be intersex and gay, you can be intersex and lesbian, you can be intersex and transgender. So all of those, and at times it can obviously become confusing, and that's why people don't understand always, like, why is the I in the acronym. However, intersex people do fall in the words is English. intersex people to fall in the category of the LGBTQI plus community. However, as it's not a sexual orientation, being born intersex, intersex people can then also take on any of the acronym that fits within their identification or their sexual orientation. I do know that when doing research, there is a lot of intersex people that sees themselves as cisgendered. So however they were labeled at birth, they see themselves as cisgendered, as either female or cisgendered male, and they therefore take on a heteronormative lifestyle, and those people would not want to be included in the conversation or in the acronym. However, intersex people that see sex as non-binary and don't believe in binaries because of how they were born and how they identify, definitely wants to be included in the conversation. And we obviously have to respect people that sees themselves as, like myself, I'm an intersex woman, so I'm not a cisgendered woman, because even though I have female characteristics, I have an XY chromosome, which would be typical male. Therefore, myself, I don't see myself as a cis woman, but I see myself as an intersex woman. Someone seeing themselves as a cisgendered woman might not want to be labeled or included. However, some might, but it's very sensitive, and I think that it's based on just the intersex person themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think this gets at some of the trickiness of the acronym is that we put sexual orientation and gender identity together, and not that they aren't unrelated for a lot of people, but that's what makes acronyms tricky. For like, I mean, I obviously can't speak for the intersex community, but at least from someone on the asexual spectrum, asexual and aromantic people tend to be excluded from conversations about queerness. And a lot of, you know, sometimes around Pride Month, you'll be like, the A stands for ally and not for asexual or aromantic, which is harmful because, you know, technically, whatever that means, by the definition of queerness being like a non-heteronormative, you know, mode of sexuality, asexual and aromantic people fall under that. So I always tend to go on the err on the side of inclusivity, do LGBTIQ plus, QA plus. But yeah, you know, I always think that listening to individuals also on a one-to-one basis is useful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, it's 8:56. So I want to make sure we have enough time for the breakout rooms. I'm just scanning the questions again. Okay, I'll ask this one last one, and then we'll go to breakout rooms. So, and Sebastian, this might be focused more on your set. So are there best practices for collecting disaggregated data in environments of criminalization? So you mentioned that this is a challenge that you've run into. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so actually we couldn't identify good practices because of the criminalization, and also because when collecting this data, we have to take into account the risk that people may be having for just talking to us in countries where same-sex desires or diverse gender identities are criminalized. However, I would say that some of the ways that this data is collected and sometimes available, it's when local defenders contact international NGOs. So that's a way to make that data available. But then again, the risks must be evaluated, and this is like mostly how we have data on countries where homosexuality is criminalized, and also, well, the data that is available at already available at the international level, such as the UN and the reports of each of the countries. So for example, if you want to find out some data on the recommendations that the UN has given to these countries in respect to data, you can go through the treaty bodies, each of the treaty bodies, which are, for example, the Human Rights Committee of the UN, the CAT Committee of the UN. They have reports on each of these countries, and they recommend them sometimes, most of the times, to review their laws on criminalization, to gather data on LGBTI persons. So this might be useful also for these purposes.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there. It's definitely hard to find them sometimes, but cool, thank you. All right, so thank you for your questions. And if we skip some, I'm sorry, but these are great conversations to have, and definitely we could be having them for the rest of our lives and not stop this. So next slide. Great, so I'm happy to introduce Noelle Schroeder, who you may have met last time if you were with us, a feminist activist, educator, and organizer in Washington, D.C. with a decade of leadership experience in nonprofit management and international solidarity work. Noelle is going to talk to us about our breakout rooms.
Hi, folks. My name's Noelle. I use they, them pronouns. I am excited to lead us into our breakout rooms. We can go to the next slide, please. So our breakout rooms are going to focus on applying what we've been talking about here today, what the panelists have shared, to our work in gender. Next slide, please. So we're going to use this space for all of us to share what we've been doing, what challenges we have, what are these next steps and changes that we can make to make our workspaces, our data collection, our relationships in our work more inclusive, more equitable. So you're going to be split into breakout rooms like Tao explained early on in the session here. And you'll be in a room including some of the panelists and facilitators here who treat them like everyone else. These are spaces to share in a non-hierarchical fashion. So these are ways for all of us to share our own experiences and really build collective knowledge. So we'll be talking around how the gender binary shows up in your own work, the ways that your work can be more inclusive for people of diverse genders, how you're engaging gender diverse groups and activists in your work, and the kind of roadblocks or challenges you might see in increasing this kind of diversity and equity in your own work. So your facilitators in each of the breakout rooms will help guide you, but this is really a space where we're all bringing expertise and knowledge into these conversations. Next slide, please. We have just a few basic guidelines to keep our discussions, again, equitable and inclusive. First, please be respectful of everyone who's participating. This is, no space is entirely safe, but this is a safer space. Please share the time equitably. So be aware of how much time or space you're taking up. And if you're not taking up much, step in, move in, and we really encourage you to share. You can share via talking, you can have your video on if you so choose, or you can type in the chat box. In these spaces, we're really seeking to center and amplify the experiences of people with marginalized identities. So again, be mindful of the identities that you hold and what you're bringing into and what space you're taking up in the discussions. This is a phrase that I really like in discussion groups, and that's stories stay, learning leaves. So these breakout groups are not being recorded. These are places to really have some deep sharing, a little vulnerability. What you learn from these breakout groups, take it back to your workplace. Say, wow, I learned this amazing thing in this discussion group I was in. But the individual stories that people share, that stays in the room. If you have any tech problems while you're in the breakout rooms, you can use the option at the bottom or maybe the top of your screen, depending on your device, that says get help, and a facilitator will be able to assist you. So now we're going to be sent into our breakout rooms. We can go to the next slide. You'll have an automatic pop-up, and please click join. Welcome back from the breakout rooms, everyone. Hope you had a fruitful and engaging discussion. So we can go to the next slide, and we're going to do a very brief report back from each of the breakout rooms. So I'll ask each of the facilitator pairs to share one thing that there was a lot of energy around in your discussion, or one thing that was really sticky, just one topic or issue that stuck out to you. Let's, the Crystal and Christina facilitator team, if one of you would like to share first.
Crystal, I might let you start because I have this puppy here who might make some noise if I try to talk.
Hey, Christina. Wow, I think that is such a beautiful session, and I felt like we could probably go for hours still if we had more time. But I think what stood out is that people are ready to learn new behaviors, and I feel that is the most important thing. People are ready to show up and to live beyond binaries and to break the binaries. And I think the main topic was that really people are thinking outside of what can we do in our workplaces to change things and to make people feel more comfortable, to make everybody feel themselves in the workplace. What steps can we take? And I think everyone in our group wants to be inclusive, and I think that was the discussion was inclusivity. How can we be inclusive, and how can we live beyond binaries? Thank you.
Thank you. How about the Nassim and Tal breakout room?
I want to just echo Crystal that we could have had these conversations for hours. I learned so much just in our brief session. But the main thing was that people are still kind of starting at the beginning, where there needs to be an acknowledgement that these problems happen, and there needs to be less of a reluctance to talk about the issues. Just talking even about issues that face binary genders, let alone then trying to break the binary from that. And that there seems to be on an institutional level across the board just a lot of reluctance to do that kind of engagement, whether that's in an educational or university system, or whether that's in a more advocacy or international based context like the UN or the EU. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Tao or Syra.
Cool. How about Sebastian and Leah?
Sebastian, you're muted. Sorry, I saw you and then you went away.
It mutes automatically. I'm so sorry. So we were talking about how to expand the notions of gender in our workplaces, and some of the things that we talked about in this regard was how to change the culture of our workplaces and to stop conceiving culture as a monolithic that cannot evolve in itself by the people who experience this culture, and not by another dominant culture that's coming to colonize it. Also to look at our policies. We were mentioning about values alignment processes, finding allies as well within our workplace to try and promote these changes, recognizing that these changes are possible, and have the voices of people who are already living outside the binary heard as much as possible within these spaces. Thank you. I don't know if Leah would like to add something else.
Perfect.
Awesome, thank you. And Chris, would you like to share from our group?
Okay, so I think the topic of is like checking the box of male or female on a form and considering like how important it is to have those things, or like is the topic of gender important to that specific situation, if it needs to be discussed at all. For example, it was about dentistry, and like I'm not a dentist myself, so I wouldn't know, but maybe it's not necessary to have a gender marker on a form like that. So maybe consider the thought of considering the gender in certain situations, basically.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm gonna throw it back to Brenna to wrap us up and close us out.
Cool, thank you. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. All right, yeah, I hope it sounds like you all had really great conversations and could keep going. So please continue these, maybe not with your exact breakout group if you don't have their contact info, but with colleagues at work, definitely friends, family. You know, we have to talk about this. So next slide, just a couple closing thoughts. Oh, I didn't realize, okay. On inclusivity, just as you are all rethinking binarism in your workplace. So seek out, I said this last time, I'll say it till I die, seek out and center the experiences and opinions of non-binary, of intersex, and of trans people. The phrase nothing about us without us. So allyship really needs to let marginalized voices speak for themselves, not to speak for them. Next, advocate for change. When you see binaries or lack of inclusivity, it's exactly what you're all talking about today. So language, data, policies, everything. So really try to, step back and think about how your work affects marginalized genders. So, maybe pretend you are one of those people and go through your day and understand like how you are affected. Or if you can, ask them or do your own research about, there's plenty of information out there about how marginalized genders are marginalized. This is very context specific. So a lot of you work in a lot of very different specific sectors. So learn from other organizations who are doing similar work or who are doing really different work who can push you. So learn from people who are doing what you want to do, like our speakers today, right? And then seek them out. They won't necessarily find you. So use the internet. There's plenty of really good information out there. Yeah, collaborate with others at work. So you can join or even start an inclusion working group, for example, where you actually work on this stuff at work, employee resource groups, etc. Hopefully you're not the only one who wants to push for more inclusivity in your work. Then understand that a lot of people are closeted for safety reasons. So be inclusive even if you don't see them. It's another reason that data, of course, is so important. And lastly, check out our resource list and add to it. You can email me, you can email SGP, you can just leave a comment and I'll incorporate it if you have some good stuff to share. Or we're going to take everything that was shared in the breakout rooms as well. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here. Like I said, we'll send the notes, we'll send the slides, the recording and everything. We're really excited that you were here. So here's our contact info. As we were saying, join our Facebook conversation, reach out if you have questions. And then if you want to have your own gender cafe, reach out to SGP as well. It's a really cool, it's a really cool experience and you'll learn a lot, I promise. So thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.